Today we're going to talk about enamels and colors and the origins of Famille Rose and sort of clarify what all the various terminology that we see. When you look up things in books, you see all kinds of interesting terms to do with colors, and they're Chinese terms, and they are words like sansai, Daosai, Utsai, Yingcai, Suzansai, Falancai, Fencai, Yancai, Ruancai, Hualancai, and so forth. And it gets very confusing because many of the names came along at different times. They often mean different things, and some of them mean almost exactly the same thing, but are just pronounced differently or viewed through it's just another way of describing the same word. And these words all end in CAI. And whenever you see the word like Wucai, it's pronounced Wucai. It's not Wucai, it's Sai, Utsai. CAI is pronounced Utsai, is pronounced Sai in Chinese. All right, just keep that in mind. I often say Wucai because I read it as because I'm an English speaker, and it comes out that way. It's all very normal. People do it all the time. So if you do it and you stumble over it, it's fine. It's no harm, no foul. And how they relate to the terms that we often think of today that are published and commonly used, which are totally Western invented words like Famille Rose, Famille Verte, Femini Noir, Famille Jaune. Those are all terminologies that came along much later in the second half of the 19th century and were put into print as a way to better understand through the Western mind what these colors are. But I want to go through some of the colors, the original colors, and then get into the Famille Rose, which we refer to as the Famille Rose palette, and how it came about and who were the influencers and so forth that did it, because it's a pretty fascinating history. And it revolutionized porcelain production that had ripple effects around the world, without any doubt. Okay, we're going to start with the word sansai. And many of you know, if you know what it is, I'm sorry, I'm repeating it, but sansai are the three color wares, the three colors that enamels that we see typically on pottery, most closely associated with the Tang Dynasty. And these were three colors on pottery, not porcelain, pottery, and there is of course a big difference. And then later on in the very beginning of the Qing Dynasty, we saw Susansai, and those are three color wares on biscuit porcelain. Okay, very similar in color to Sansai from the Tang Dynasty, but it's on porcelain. So Susansai is porcelain, Sansai is pottery. All right, and then you have the term Daosai, which was a combination of techniques utilized during the Ming Dynasty it was first discovered in some ways during the Zhuangde period, but became most well known from the Chunhua era. And this was a combination of underglazed blue decoration and outlines and so forth, and then overglazed enamels that were softened and so forth. But the color palette itself was very limited. It was very, very limited, just a few colors, but they could soften them with over enamels and so forth to make them look a bit better, a bit more beautiful. And of course, the most famous Daosai porcelain in the world is the Imperial chicken cup that sold. There's only a handful of them in the world, maybe 4 or 5, and one of them sold, as you may recall, 10 years ago. It was on the headlines. It brought $35 million. It was a little 1.5-inch cup. All right, and then you have Utsai, and this is an area that it starts to lead into some of these areas of confusion. Utsai are just 5 colored wares. Not a lot of color range in Utsai. Reds, greens, yellows, aubergine, and so forth. Occasionally, there's sort of a teal green that they were able to produce by putting a little enamel over the overglazed enamel to give it a different hue. But in general, it was a very limited color palette, but could be very effective if used properly. And Wucai enamels are first came around, the first use of it, according to Susan Wallenstein, was again during the first Wucai enamels were during the Zhuangde period, and then became much more developed during the Jiajing period in the 16th century. All right, and those are the 5 color wares that we often think of, and often very much associated with Famille Verte. Famille Verte and Wucai are kissing cousins. Okay, basically, the Wucai enamels are often generally referred to as being Ming colors. Famille Verte was a term that was applied typically to that color slate of greens, reds, and yellows during the Kangxi period, but they are basically in the same family. It's just a different period. And then there's Yingcai, which is also part of the sort of the Utsai nomenclature. And it's a generic term that just means hard colors, and that includes the Utsai or Famille Verte colors. So you have Yingcai and Wucai and Famille Verte. They're all sort of in the same boat. The Famille Verte is the Western term, and Yingcai and Wucai are is the Chinese explanation of it. And Yingcai just means hard color, and it doesn't mean any specific color. It's just a term like the red in Wucai is a hard color. It's Yingcai. The greens on Wucai enamels are Yingcai. They're hard colors. All right. It's a tone, not a particular color. It's just the tone of that enamel. And it was this palette was very heavily used during the Qing dynasty, right up to around 1720. And then after that, during the Chen period, very little Famille Verte or Wucai or Yingcai enamels were used, and it sort of fell out of fashion. And then the next term you have, if I confused you yet, we'll go through it, we'll review it. The next term is Hualancai, and this is a general term. It's not often used anymore, and it just applies to the term that just means enamels. So if you see the word Hualancai, the vase was decorated with Hualancai, it just means it was decorated with enamels, and that's all it means. It doesn't imply any particular color or type or anything. It just means simply enamel colors. All right, and this was how things were up until the introduction of what we commonly today refer to as Famille Rose. All right, and it all began in Germany in the 1670s. These colors were foreign colors, and this is a very important thing to know. The Famille Rose palette, these soft colors, these warm pinks and warm yellow, these beautiful yellows and greens and all these different shades, was actually an invention of a German alchemist named Dr. Andreas Cassius. And in the 1670s, he was working in Nuremberg, Germany, and he was mixing colors and constant experimentation, and eventually he stumbled across this way of mixing colloidal gold and other chemicals to come up with these very soft Famille Rose colors that we know today as Famille Rose. Okay? And those started there. That's where it all began. And what happened was the news of this color, and he did it primarily to decorate glass and other and metalwares, other things. They weren't decorating porcelain because they didn't know how to make porcelain at that time. But they had other things that they could decorate with enamels, and in particular glass and metals. Okay. And it became very popular. And before you knew it, the Jesuits that were going back and forth between China and Europe heard about this, and they thought, this is something pretty interesting. We should bring some of this technology to the emperor. And because they were always trying to appease the emperor, they wanted to be happy with them. The Jesuits were constantly seeking influence and being involved in the court and all this. And this was a great way to do it because they knew that the emperor was interested in this sort of thing, and this would be a way to really expand. It would be like going almost like from black and white to Technicolor, as far as they were concerned. This was going to be a giant leap for them. So they brought them. And in around 1696, they began using these new colors, these Famille Rose colors, as we refer to them, at the workshops where they were doing cloisonné. They were doing works on metal because that's what they were using them for in Europe. So they thought, well, we'll do them here. And China was not a big glass producer, so the main area of application for these initially was cloisonné. And the coloring technique began being used, and they were producing these wonderful things at the Beijing workshops at the Imperial Palace, which Kangxi had established. And a few decades later, he was a Jesuit, Father Matteo Ripa, wrote a letter in 1716 writing on extensively about the emperor's reaction to these new colors and a desire that he expressed, could these new colors be used in porcelain production? Because the Chinese by then, of course, were very proficient at producing porcelain, and he wanted to know if these enamels could be applied to and stick to porcelain, because this would be a great thing, because I think the color palettes were so limited. It would be like you had 5 primary colors, now you have the rainbow. You have endless colors that you could possibly produce with these. And they went to work in around 1717. Some of the very, very first Chinese porcelains with Famille Rose enamels were developed, and they were a smash hit. and the emperor loved them and so forth, and they began working on them in more earnest. And they became very proficient with them, and they tried new color combinations, mixing new chemicals to develop new shades and so forth. And they invented many new shades during this time, but not as many as they were about to. And within a few years, by 1725, they were really coming into their stride with this stuff. But they wanted more. They wanted more. And these enamels, when they began doing them at the Imperial Palace, and it's the only place they were being used, these new colors were being used at the Imperial workshops in the porcelain workshops, were known as Hualancai. Hualancai, and you see this word occasionally. They are the rarest of the enameled porcelains by far. There's only about 400 known pieces left in the world, which is an extremely small group. And all of these were made for the imperial family. And what would happen was that they had the imperial kilns in Jingdezhen. So orders would be sent up there to produce palace wares, and somebody would go up and they would hand select the very, very finest bowls and send them down to the imperial palace, to the atelier there, to be decorated by the court painters, the court decorators. They would go to work on them and apply these new colors and experiment and so forth. And these were the very personal bowls, small bowls, cups, things that were made for the use of the imperial family. Not everybody at the palace, because thousands of people worked and lived around the imperial palace, but it was for the people that were the inner sanctum, the royal family itself. And eventually the workshop, I don't know if it started out there, but eventually the imperial atelier for decorating enamels was right adjacent to the emperor's living quarters within the inner sanctums of the palace, because he wanted to be able to go and look and see what they were up to next. The emperors became absolutely fascinated with this new color because of the possibilities, because of the beauty and so forth. And it also distinguished them as having the finest pieces. And this was the latest thing. All right. And at this point, we have to sort of stop for just a minute and say a bit about one guy that came along during this time period, after the death of Kangxi. The Emperor Yongchen took over, and the introduction of a man named Tang Ying, who was born in 1682 and he died in 1756. And he and Andreas Cassius had more to do with this development than probably these new colors and this evolution that's more or less has swept across the world than any other two people. And Tang Ying, we've talked about him before in other videos, but I'm going to review it because he was a very fascinating guy. He came from a fairly prominent Chinese family. His father was was a bannerman and so forth. And he began his career as a page at the imperial household department at the age of 16. And he worked at the Yangshin Hall, and that was a library within the inner sanctum of the palace, that had books and manuscripts and art and all kinds of creative things. And this is where he worked. And he was very interested in painting, all right, and art and that sort of thing, cultural things. And the imperial household department was very important. If you don't know what it was the inner sanctum, more or less, the management of the imperial house directly on a personal level to just strictly to the service of the imperial family. They were very powerful. The people who worked in the imperial household department had a lot of influence. They had a lot of access to the emperor and his family and the children and the different concubines and everything. They were there all the time. They were like the personal servants and managers to the family, outside of the bureaucratic stuff that went on as far as the military and shipping and taxes and trade and all this. They were there to serve the family. And because they were there to serve the family, they became pretty close to a lot of them. And this department was actually created in 1661, early on in the Qing dynasty, because they wanted to get rid of the eunuchs, because the eunuchs during the Ming dynasty had caused a lot of trouble within a lot of palace intrigue, so to speak. And when the Qing Empire came along, they decided the eunuch system, the old system of having eunuchs in charge of managing the imperial household, had to end. It wasn't working, and they were very, very worried about additional upheavals and problems. Because you remember that from the end of the Ming dynasty into the beginning of the Qing, that 50-year period was an era of enormous upheaval and turmoil and battles and wars, and they were done with that, and they wanted to stabilize the country and unify it under the new Qing government. All right, so they brought in people who were staff with bond servants and other officials from prominent families who were trusted, well-educated, and were viewed to have been very, very loyal. And this was all done to forestall a possible usurping of power by as I said, the eunuchs. This was all done to hold them back. And the department became a power outside of the control of the bureaucracy itself. It sort of went along its own way. And as long as they were maintaining things for the imperial family, they were allowed to do what they wanted to do that would benefit the imperial family. And this was a very much an inner sanctum thing. And during this time, Tang Ying, unsurprisingly, became acquainted. He was working around the palace. He was working in the library. He became acquainted with the next emperor who would assume the throne after the death of Kangxi, who was Kangxi's son, Yongchen. And he was just a prince, but they knew each other. And apparently Yongchen valued Tang Ying and viewed him as being, he was older than Yongchen, and viewed him as being a man of respect, a man of intellect, and so forth. And soon after, when Yongchen ascended to the throne in the early 1720s, he appointed Tang Ying to be the vice director of the imperial household department, which was a major, major step. And he acted, among other things, as a foreman to the making of porcelain at the imperial palace and its decoration. And he was very interested in it. And he began creating his own designs for porcelain at that time and so forth. And while Tang Ying was also a painter, a calligrapher, later in life he wrote plays and books and one thing and another. He was a very interesting man. He was a Renaissance man of his time, highly intelligent and highly ethical by most standards, okay, or by all accounts anyway. And he had an extremely good eye. And but he knew almost nothing about making porcelain, but he was a quick learner. At any rate, he was by most accounts a very trusted individual. And during the Yongchen reign, after he had served as the vice director of the household department, in 1728, Yongchen asked him to take over the kilns in Jingdezhen, and to be the supervisor of the kilns at the imperial kilns, where they made the imperial porcelain that was either decorated at the imperial kilns and also produced the porcelains that would be sent to the palace to be decorated in the atelier. So he was sent up there to be in charge of it, as well as being appointed to collect taxes, customs and duties and so forth, and manage the money from that part. It was a very prosperous area of China, and there was a lot of money floating around. And previously, during the Kangxi reign, a lot of money had been stolen from the treasury by dishonest government officials. Oh, surprise! They'd borrow money and never pay it back, and so forth. And they had to rein that in because the Chinese government at that time was spending, no surprise, a lot more money than they were taking in, and they had to get it all back under control. And Tang Ying, up in the Jingdezhen area, was considered to be a good, honest man to take over and manage the money and supervise the kilns at the same time, something he enjoyed much more. But he did take over and do his tax collection duties, and apparently he did it very, very well. And he went up there and began running the kilns, began supervising, participating, and he learned how to make porcelain. He learned how the potting processes worked, and then he began introducing ideas for new colors, new design palettes, and so forth. He designed things and so forth, and that went on for the rest of Yongchen's life. Yongchen died fairly not long. He was a fairly short-lived emperor, as most of you know. He died in 1735 at a fairly young age. He was 56 years old, but he died, they believe it was from poisoning. And they believe that he was assassinated. There's a whole bunch of theories about who did it and so forth. But regardless, Yongchen died, but Tang Ying stayed on. And when Yongchen's son Qinlong came into power, he said, "No, you stay there. You're doing a good job. You're collecting taxes for the empire, and you have integrity, and I like what you do." All right. So there was basically a seamless transition in the porcelain making from Yongchen to Qinlong. And many times you'll see listings for auction items in museums, things that come up, and they'll say Yongchen to Qinlong period, because they really can't tell the difference. There was no giant difference between the latter years of the Yongchen period and the next generation of Qinlong examples. And he's over this time that he was there, Tang Ying oversaw the development of a lot of new colors and glazes and potting techniques, and he was always pushing for new innovations. He even made some porcelain himself, and they've turned up at auctions over the years. They bring quite a lot of money. And he also brought back old styles of creating porcelain and ceramics, in particular from the Sung dynasty, because the emperors were fascinated with that era, and they bring back Guan wares and Yi wares and so forth. So Tang Ying really was interested in all of it. So he was interested in the old styles. He was interested in the new styles. He was very interested in developing broader and broader color palettes for enameling techniques and so forth, and glazes to please the palace. Again, remember he had worked at the inner sanctum of the palace for the household department, and this is what he was raised to do. This was his mission in life, was to serve the emperor personally and serve him well. All right, and that's a very important thing to know. All right, so that's where all that was. So now we get back to the enamels from this time, but I thought it was good to sort of color it in a little bit who Tang Ying was. He's a fascinating man. You can find out a lot about him out there. We hear the word, we heard the word Hualancai, which means enamels from the palace. And then there's a term called Yancai. And this was a term that was introduced by Tang Ying. And Tang Ying first used it in writing, and it just means the word, Yancai just means foreign colors, or the colors that we got from the Jesuits many years ago. That's all it means. It means, and everybody knows that by saying foreign colors, it means these soft reds and soft colors, this new color palette. It's just another way of describing it. And he first used that term, Yancai, around 1735 in his records when he was doing it. All right. And then you heard the word Ruancai, which it's rarely used, but it means basically the same thing. It means soft colors. Yancai refers to porcelains decorated at the Imperial kilns, I should point out, not at the palace. So when you hear the term Yancai, it means decorated at the Imperial kilns, not at the Imperial studios in the palace. They were two separate things. All right. They were very fine quality, but not as rare or not quite as extraordinary from a connoisseurship standard as the pieces that were painted by the best artists who worked within the palace. All right. But absolutely mind-blowing stuff. Absolutely beautiful. And the Yancai refers to these new wares through the eyes of Tang Ying. This was his word. This was something he came up with. The more popular term today for this is Fencai. And Fencai is a relatively new term. People see this and they think this came from that time. It actually didn't come into common usage, from what I've read, until the 20th century, when it was used in Europe by Chinese representatives setting up for an exhibit. And they called it Fencai, and it simply means soft colors, or foreign soft colors, a softer color palette, as opposed to Utsai or Famille Verte. All right. Now, in the term Hualancai, you may see occasionally, very rarely, it's not often used. The word Hualancai simply means enamels. And it doesn't mean Famille Rose enamels or Famille Verte enamels as we look at them. It just means enamel, an enamel color. And an enamel color can be in any palette, pretty much, as far as I can tell. And that was a term that was introduced during the Kangxi period, sort of at the end of his life. All right. So what we have is we've got all these different colors, and how do they relate to one another? Well, let's see. You've got Hualancai, which means decorated at the Imperial Palace. You have Yancai, which means decorated at the Imperial Kilns. You have Fencai, which also means soft colors, but was invented during the 20th century. And then you have Ruancai, which is a general, though not often used term, and it loosely means soft color. And Hualancai, which means enamel color. And then you have Wucai and Yingcai, which mean hard colors. Okay? And how that translates over was this translation into the Famille, when you hear the word Famille Rose, Famille Verte, and so forth. This was an invention, basically, of a French collector named Albert Jacquemart. And in 1862, he was looking for a descriptive series of terminologies and so forth that was understandable to the West, about the colors that you could see in Chinese porcelain. So he started them all with famille, which just means family. and it would be the family of rose colors, for example, Famille Rose. All right, and rose colors could also mean other tones and shades as well, soft colors, soft, very soft colors that were part of this invention of the German alchemist and brought to China during the Kangxi period, and originally started out as Hualancai. So Famille Rose means, basically, it's an all-encompassing term for all of the all of the enamels that we think of today. So that were the new palette. So Famille Rose covers Hualancai, Yancai, Hualancai, Ruancai, and then Fencai, which came along much later. All right, they all fall under the Famille Rose category. And then the term Famille Verte, which was sort of a Kangxi period description, means green and red and opaque enamels and so forth, is basically the same as Wucai and Yingcai. All right, so Kangxi period opaque enamels that predated the introduction of the European colors that were brought in that was such a big hit. So originally it was just those, and then you have Famille Verte, which are of course again the Utsai palette. Okay, and that's so forth, and then you hear other things like Famille Noir and Famille Jaune. And this really sort of confuses things, because Famille Noir just means the dominant color of the vase, like black underglaze or black glazed wares. Like the vase, the primary color that's most obvious is black. And those were called Famille Noir, because noir is French for black. And Famille Jaune is yellow ground vases, like this. Okay, so you have yellow ground vases, and they could have almost any color palette on it on Famille Jaune. You could find them with Famille Rose decoration. You can find them with grisaille decoration. You can find them with some Utsai decoration or Famille Verte decorations. So Famille Jaune is just the overall color scheme, the ground color. And then Famille Noir, most typically, the black vases started during the Kangxi period, and then sort of went out of fashion during the Qianlong period, and then came back as revival pieces, but later in the 19th century. But Kangxi Famille Noir pieces, black ground, typically have a Famille Verte palette or Wucai palette to them. So you have Famille Rose, Famille Verte, Famille Noir, and Famille Jaune. All right, so you have these different categories, and in the case of Famille Noir and Famille Jaune, it's the ground color, and then Famille Rose and Famille Verte are the enamels that were applied to the vase, regardless of what the ground color is, to give it the decoration. Vines and leaves and flowers and people and all this stuff. They were the ones those were the two color palettes that were most prominent. There were other colors too, but they were really the lion's share of it. And then you have, of course, Hualancai, Yancai, Fencai, Ruancai, Hualancai, Utsai, or Yingcai. And those are the original colors, and they all came in at different times. And this is where it gets very, very confusing. And I know it's difficult. You sort of have to go through and study this. Down below this video, I'm going to put sort of a list in that you can go and read to further understand it. Because you encounter these words a great deal when looking up pieces, looking at catalogs. You'll see these terms come and go, and you're always wondering, well, what exactly is that referring to? All right, and this is hopefully a fairly good explanation of what they all mean. And if you have any questions, just ask them in the comments below. But it's a fascinating bit of Chinese history. It's a fascinating bit of history in general, because these colors and the designs of these colors spread out across the world. And these colors began getting adopted by and used by in very much in the manner that the Chinese were using, because the Chinese added new ways of creating colors. And many of these colors were adopted in Europe, porcelain factories, as once porcelain was developed over there, and it had a massive ripple effect. They copied the designs, and there were lots and lots and lots of European porcelain factories that made direct copies of Chinese pieces that, to the naked eye, sometimes are difficult to differentiate. And of course, then you have the Samson factory in France that did pieces that to this day are mislabeled as being Chinese. sometimes when they're not. So it was an enormous thing. And I hope you found this interesting. And thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do. And if you have any questions, ask it. And have a great week. Thank you. Bye-bye.